Hello, everybody. Good morning from Kyiv. In an exclusive interview with President Zelenskyy, he warned of a new Russian offensive against Ukraine. He told me that Russian forces are building up in the south and also the east of the country. And in an emotional message to the parents of those soldiers, he warned nobody is meeting them with flowers. It's not their homeland or their homes they are dying for. In a wide-ranging interview, we also spoke about his own journey from comedian to wartime leader and the impact on his family life. We'll bring that to you throughout the morning, and we'll have reaction from around Europe, some of the key players, including the NATO Secretary-General. I sat down with President Zelenskyy in his office here in Kyiv. Mr. President, there's talk of a Russian surge coming soon. When do you think that might be, and how prepared are you?
Ми бачимо 6 днів вже посилення як на півдні нашої держави, Запорізький регіон, так само і на сході нашої держави. Ми це бачимо. Наприклад, на сході вони втрачають велику кількість людей. Ну, просто неосяжно. Їм все одно. Ну, тобто вони не рахують людей. Факт. Ми рахуємо їх людей. І то у нас немає прям точних цифр, скільки їх загинуло більше. Але тих, кого ми реально бачимо і рахуємо, ми вже бачимо, і там тисячі людей. І вони їх просто кидають і кидають, кидають і кидають. Ось що ми бачимо. Тому наступ у них спроможний з будь-якого напрямку, це правда. Просто в деяких напрямках вони будуть використовувати більше людей. Як результат буде більше трупів.
War rips families apart. A lot of young Russian boys are being sent to their deaths as cannon fodder. What's your message to their parents?
Як можна відпустити дитину, розуміючи, що вона загине, забираючи чуже? Тобто ви, відпускаючи свою дитину, ви вже робите з неї злодія. І це злодійство. І це вбивство, це не захист, не самозахист, це вбивство, спеціально направлене вбивство. І за це все прийдеться відповідати. І якщо будуть в полоні, одна відповідальність, або буде відповідальність перед Богом в будь-якому випадку, але вони залишаються молодими на цій землі через амбіції президента Путіна, однієї людини.
Abrams tanks are coming from the United States, and finally, Leopard 2 tanks are coming from Europe. You must be relieved.
Ще ні. Щойно? Шольц? Тільки що? Ну, у мене з Шольцем буде розмова. Ось зараз прес-секретар сказав, що щойно канцлер Шольц підтвердив, що дасть Леопарди. У мене зустріч одразу з ним розмова по телефону одразу після нашого інтерв'ю. Я дуже радий, хочу подякувати Німеччині. Я дякую Британії і дякую Сполученим Штатам Америки за те, що вони...
The tanks could be here from Europe soon, but the tanks from America may take until August. Is that too late?
Too late. But I don't know really. I don't know real situation for now, for this minute, when they will be, when America will give us Abrams, and I don't know. I don't know really when from Europe will come tanks.
Can I take you back to almost a year ago and the start of the war? Could you tell us what you remember about the night that the Russians were coming? How close were they to you? Some suggestions they were just 2 kilometers away.
Послухайте, для мене це, така просто частина війни. Скільки таких людей було і скільки замахів, не вірте, коли кажуть хтось, це були десятки разів, тощо, я не знаю. Може якісь спецслужби знають краще.
May I ask you about peace talks, Mr. President? Under what circumstances would you consider peace negotiations?
Ніяких розмов, і це було до початку вторгнення. Президент Путін вирішив це. Я впевнений в цьому, що Україна – це перший крок на його шляху. Я впевнений, що він займається саме великою війною. Росія відійде на свою територію, вони визнають свої великі помилки, і це будуть інші люди при владі Російської Федерації, Ми сусіди. І тоді нам прийдеться розбиратися з цією ситуацією. Тоді, напевно, це буде можливо.
If you can't sleep at night and are alone with your thoughts, do you ever wonder what might happen if you were in a room alone with President Putin? Would that help at all to resolve this war?
It's not interesting for me. Not interesting to meet. Not interesting to speak. Why? Because we had meeting with him in Normandy format. It was before the full-scale invasion. I saw the man who said one thing and then did another.
Is it too late now?
Too late? Not interesting. Who is he now? After full-scale invasion, for me, he's nobody. Nobody.
Somebody who is a somebody to you is Boris Johnson. Would you like to see him have an official public role as a UK envoy to Ukraine?
Embassy? He will be ambassador from Britain in Ukraine? With pleasure. With pleasure. He's a good guy. And I'm not sure that he's ready for such status because, no, but who knows? I mean that with pleasure, really.
How would you feel if he ran again to be Prime Minister? Would he get your support?
I think that it's not correct to me to support Johnson to be a prime minister when Rishi is prime minister. It's not correct. I'm sorry. We have good relations with Sunak. I think we had more long relations with Johnson because it was more long time and of course, very difficult time at the first days of full-scale invasion. That's why I saw Johnson in different situations. I saw him not in war and then in full-scale war. That's why we have special relations.
We'll have more of that interview with President Zelenskyy throughout the programme here on Sky News, and we will play it in full at 9:30. Absolutely fascinating stuff from him, including what it's like to be a former comedian who is now a leader of a world country at war. Coming up in just a second, we're also going to be speaking to Dominic Waghorn, who is in Brandenburg for us, and taking you to Moscow as well with Diana Magnay to find out what the Russians are thinking about these tanks that have been promised for Ukraine. Before all of that, though, Deborah Haynes is here with me this morning. Hi, good morning. So the President was very pleased with his 45th birthday. When will it materialise?
Well, that's the big question, and that's why his main message, wasn't it, about how it's great having these tanks, but the critical issue is when they will arrive and in what numbers. And the reason for that is because the offensive, plans for the offensive are happening right now, and the sooner the Ukrainian offensive happens, the better, because the Russians too are rearming. You have this big mobilisation that happened in September. There is talk of potentially a second mobilisation by the Russians, talk of potentially hundreds of thousands of Russian forces being part of a second wave. The Ukrainians know that time isn't on their side. They need to act fast. They need to have credible capability, which is where these tanks come in, if they're trained on them, and that takes months potentially. Some have said that if you had trained if you had tank operators that are using the Ukrainian Soviet-era tanks now, they could actually be moved onto the British tanks pretty quickly. But, for example, I was talking to a British tankie in Estonia last week, and he was saying to me that these tanks, they're quite old. I mean, they are modern tanks compared to Soviet-era ones, but they were built in the 90s. They are due an upgrade, and they do have little niggles, and it really takes time to understand the tank and how to get the most out of it. And so that's why really getting these tanks out here as soon as possible so that they can be used as part of a full offensive with artillery, with other armoured vehicles to push against these entrenched Russian positions is key. But the Ukrainians will be mindful of when the Russians are planning to attack as well. And while, yes, a lot of their equipment has been depleted, the Russian industrial base is being mobilised to ramp up production, and we're just not seeing that amongst Western allies to the same extent. And just one final point, that they were saying yesterday how this announcement about tanks shows the determination of the West to support Ukraine, sends that clear message message to Vladimir Putin that the West isn't going away, that they aren't just going to leave Ukraine. But the most fundamental way they could send that message more credibly, even more credibly than the tanks, would be by ramping up that production of artillery, of ammunition, to ensure that they physically have the means to support Ukraine into the long term.
They also want fighter jets now as well, don't they? But that's a conversation that is ongoing.
It is. Well, it's all about escalation. I mean, it's incredible, isn't it, that we are here now, almost a year into this war, with main battle tanks now being agreed. You know, we can both remember back in the early days, allies, in particular, Germany was sending helmets. It didn't want to send offensive, lethal weapons. It's gone from helmets to tanks in the space of 12 months. There was that huge threat, and it continues to be a concern about Vladimir Putin escalating, turning this into a war of Russia against NATO, the whole of the NATO alliance, or maybe turning to the nuclear option. And clearly the allies have absorbed those threats, have calculated that sending tanks is not sufficiently escalatory to be too dangerous. And who knows, maybe they will decide in time that even more lethal equipment such as fighter jets could be needed too.
OK, for now, thanks so much indeed, Deborah. Thank you. We're in the middle of St Michael's Square, the biggest square in central Kyiv this morning. As you can see, remnants of Russian tanks have been dragged here as they have been deactivated, as they describe it, by Ukrainian forces. It's a show of strength, a show of power, not only to the world, but also to President Putin. Our Moscow correspondent, Diana Magne, joining us now. Hello to you, Diana. Nevertheless, the Ukrainians have had these tanks promised to them. It will take a long time for them to get here. Meantime, a new Russian surge on the horizon.
That's true. Well, the Ukrainians say they expect a spring offensive from the Russians, but of course the Russians expect the Ukrainians to try and recapture territory when the time is right. So I think both of them are looking to see how best they can move forward when conditions make it possible. I think this tank delivery will be viewed with concern here, of course, because it does to a certain extent change the state of play. How Valery Gerasimov reacts, we just don't know at the moment. But as we heard in that interview and reading the full transcript, it's just fascinating to see what President Zelenskyy had to say about the fact that, sure, it's great, this promise of tanks, but frankly, it's not the decision that matters. It's when they arrive on the battlefield. Russia has many, many more tanks. Russia has many, many more armoured vehicles. And the Ukrainians just need those tanks, more armoured vehicles, more weapons in service right now to try and recapture some of that territory that they've lost to Russia. I do expect to hear more comments from Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, when he has his daily call today. He's been asked about the tanks for quite a few times already, because obviously this has been discussed a lot in Europe. And I think what will be disappointing for Moscow is to see once again resolution and unity amongst NATO members, because for the past few weeks he could point to this dithering by Germany, the lack of unity on the issue of tanks as a mark of fractures within the alliance. But once again they've actually pulled together, and I think that will be viewed with some consternation in Moscow. But again, the battle tanks fall into the Russian narrative that this is in fact already a war which they say NATO is waging against Russia to try and destroy Russia. I think the comments that Zelenskyy said that Putin is a nobody, that they only want peace when they want to regroup, will be dismissed as well by Moscow, because Moscow always dismisses what President Zelenskyy says, calls him simply a puppet of the West, Ukraine simply a proxy battleground. So I don't think this decision is going to change the narrative that you hear from Russia, but I think there is so much in that interview that you did, Kay, that's absolutely fascinating.
OK, Diana, for now, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Well, is there a fracture developing within NATO? Yesterday I spoke to the Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg. He said that Ukraine must be prepared for a ramping up of action by Russia. This is what he had to tell me.
Russia is planning for new offensives. They are building heavily up. They are mobilized hundreds of thousands of new troops, ramping up production, acquiring ammunition from authoritarian regimes like Iran, North Korea, and and therefore we have to be prepared for new Russian offensives.
And we'll bring you more of Jens Stoltenberg's reaction to my interview with President Zelenskyy just after 8 o'clock. Joined now, though, by Labour's Shadow Defence Secretary, that's John Healey. Hello to you, Mr Healey, from Kyiv. This morning you heard what the Germans, what the Americans and indeed what President Zelenskyy has had to say about this war in Ukraine. Is the West doing enough to help the Ukrainians?
It's doing much of what Ukraine is asking for. This is a really important move and decision by Germany. And what's important here is not just the tanks, but also the artillery, the armoured vehicles, the ammunition. It was part of a big package that Britain committed in recent weeks, the 1st of 2023. Allies are doing similar. And it confronts one of the biggest miscalculations that Putin made by his brutal and illegal invasion of Ukraine last year, which was he miscalculated on the determination and resolution of the Western countries to stand together, stand with Ukraine, and to remain united. And that decision by the Germans now about Leopard tanks allows other countries to move together to support Ukraine in this battle to see off the Russian aggression and reclaim their own country.
Do you think that Germany's hesitancy has damaged their reputation at all?
I think, of course, Ukraine would like a lot more, and it would like it yesterday. But Germany has given a contribution to the military assistance to Ukraine, which is on a similar scale to Britain's. It has made some historic moves, as your correspondent Deborah Haynes said earlier on. What's crucial now is that the Western countries willing to support Ukraine, and there are more than 40 countries who are supporting Ukraine in this battle, remain united and continue their supplies for the long term. So I've argued for many months now that the government needs to move beyond ad hoc announcements, as we saw last week, of military support to Ukraine, which have our full support, but move beyond those ad hoc announcements to a full plan for 2023 and beyond for the military, economic, humanitarian assistance we'll provide to Ukraine, in part because that will give Ukraine greater confidence and reassurance that British support will be maintained, but also it will signal to Putin that things will get worse, not better for Russia.
What more support do you think that the UK could offer the people and the president of Ukraine at the moment? He wants fighter jets.
Well, Britain doesn't have any of the F-16 fighters that are being talked about today. In opposition, we're not party to the conversations about what the Ukrainians are asking for. And on fighter jets, I noticed that this is a debate that's being led by the manufacturer of the fighter jets, Lockheed Martin. What's most important, I think, in Britain is that we now put parts of our military procurement system on a wartime footing so that we can provide the ammunition and supplies, not just to continue supporting Ukraine, but to replenish our own armed forces stocks. And it really isn't good enough that it took the MOD 287 days to get its act together to sign a contract to start producing the anti-tank weapons, the NLAWs, that we provided in the early days of the invasion, which proved so successful and so important and continue to be so to Ukraine.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's just Lockheed Martin that are talking about fighter jets. I think you'll find that President Zelenskyy was pleading for them during my interview with him yesterday. He says that the fight in the air could be the way that they win this war against Russia. We'll have to wait and see on that. A final question to you, though, if I may. If and when Labour is in power, what percentage of GDP would you give to the defence budget? 3%?
Well, in the last year that Labour was in power in 2010, Britain was spending 2.5% of our budget on defence, and that's the level the Conservatives have not got anywhere near matching in the 13 years since. Labour will always spend what's required on defence. What's required on defence depends on the assessment of the threats. That's a hard judgment to make in opposition when all the information required to do that is classified. So that's why we've said in year one, after an election, Labour would launch a strategic defence and security review. It would allow us to make those judgments and make those financial commitments.
OK, it's good to speak to you this morning. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let's turn to the next part of our interview with President Zelenskyy, should we? He's become a symbol of his country's resistance, of course, to Russia's invasion. He's a wartime leader with a direct line to Downing Street and the White House, and yet he lives with the constant threat that his own life could be targeted. So what does all that do to your day-to-day life? We find out with a very rare glimpse of the president at work.
Thank you
Nice to meet
so
you.
much, and you too. Thank you for taking the time and
Thank you
giving
for
us so
calling.
much of your time. I wonder if we could walk along the corridor and you could... I noticed some of these pictures of Ukrainians and
heroes,
heroes, yeah. Tell me about them.
That's what I say. That's, you know, I think that you can see here our veterans from 2014.
Veterans from the war in Crimea, bearing witness to the challenges the latest conflict is having on this battle-hardened Ukrainian regime. Security is extremely tight around the president, as you would expect. Our passports were checked several times. Phones and laptops removed and stored well away from President Zelenskyy. Eventually, after making our way through airport-style scanners, we were guided along darkened corridors past bulging sandbags and close protection officers bristling with weaponry, and into these gloomy halls.
Stages in English, poverty stages.
Floors,
Yeah. Sorry,
yeah.
yes.
And this is, I mean, this is dark as well. It's one of the things that strikes me.
We have to economy electricity
Oh, I
is true.
see.
We have
Okay.
big deficit because of Iranian attacks by drones. Russian attacks by Iranian drones. I think it will be correctly. But for us, it's the same. If Russia uses Iranian drones, it means that Iran helps.
I understand.
Russia.
Yeah.
That's it. Yes.
What's a normal day like for you here? How do you live your life here?
That is my life
Yeah.
now. Yes, how I live here.
Yeah, I mean, what do you do? You eat at the palace? You
I eat,
work
sleep
at the palace?
here,
Yeah.
and I work here.
Do you manage,
Everything is
do you manage to
here.
go get exercise here? What do you do?
Yes, I have exercise. Yes, at the very morning, early in the morning, I love to read and have some exercise.
Right.
Yes, of course. I wake up, and get up about 6 in the morning, and love to read if I have some time.
And
to
then
have
what
some
happens? Talk me through your day briefly. You get up, you exercise, you read.
and work. That's it. Work till night, and that's it. And
Bed.
sometimes, yes, bed, and sometimes you have to get up through the night, yes, because of some, phone calls or very important things or decisions. Sometimes.
Can we sit down and have a chat?
Yes, please.
Fantastic, thank you.
We wanted to know more about the comedian turned world leader, who's not only a politician, but the father of 2 children. One, a 17-year-old student, and a 10-year-old son, who talks to his father about events on the battleground rather than fun in the playground.
Talk to me about your family life. You talked about them having to leave just before, when the war was breaking out. You see them very rarely.
I think the question is to my family. Am I good? Like father, their attitude to me, I think it's also not, I don't know if I can use such word, not polite to speak about me, about me in such case, but I think that they love me. And it's not about thinking, I feel it. I think this feeling is the best one, and I want to save it. Yes, and that is the most important I have. So my family.
How often do you manage to see them?
How much?
How often do you manage?
Often my wife, then my children. It's a pity that I can see my children, once per. Now it's oftener than from the very beginning. Last 2-3 months we have once per 10 days. I can see my children 1 per 2 weeks. I see, have some food, have some talks, and I can see my daughter because she's a student from this year, and that's why I often see her than my son. He's a small guy.
He's just young.
He's just young. He's 10 years.
Yeah. What do you talk about?
Oh, I think I'm listening. He's talking. He's so good. He's so sweet, and he's 10 years, but he's thinking like a tragedy for all our families. I mean, that through Ukraine, because all our children, adults, and all of them, they speak about war. They speak about when we will win. They know it exactly. It's better than they know, better than me, I think.
When you will win the war.
Yes, they will win tomorrow, and it's about our children. And they know everything, about what's going on. We need tanks. What the chancellor, he's waiting. We have to push. We don't have F-16. We have to push them. So it's very interesting. I mean that, but it's interesting. And from one side, from another side, like I said to you, it's tragedy that they speak about it, not about children's, not about their games between each other, not about soccer. Yes, no dialogues about soccer. So that is the difference. But we will change this situation, I think.
Deborah with us throughout the morning here on The Breakfast Show live from Kyiv this morning as the snow continues to fall. It's absolutely freezing. Those kids will be going to school, though, as they do every day whenever they can. But he was saying there, the President, they talk about F-16s, not soccer.
Yes, and that's the kids that do go to school. You'll remember that at the beginning of the war, lots of those children, the schools stopped, the country stopped. There was this nationwide loss of innocence in that one day when these children had to basically grow up far too quickly. Many of them had to leave. The children in some parts of these countries are still doing their lessons online, if they even can have internet. And then the children here in Kyiv and around the parts of the countries where it's a bit more stable, yes, they're going to school, but often they don't have power, they don't have heat. There's the threat of missile strikes. There's been this awful attack on the critical infrastructure. So for parents that are here, it's that constant worry every day. It's just not normal life. And how awful. I mean, the President's living it himself with his children. And this idea that the children aren't talking about having fun. They're talking about whether they're going to get F-16s, even knowing what an F-16 is. And then as well to remember the children that have left this country, their fathers have not left. They've stayed behind. And so this has been this huge division, this separation of families all across the world now with their fathers here in Ukraine fighting the war.
OK, Deborah, thanks so much indeed for now. Thank you. Well, Dominic Macron actually has just spoken to the German Defence Minister, and this is what he had to say.
Minister, can you get the tanks to Ukraine in time?
Of course we will.
How long will it take to get there?
At the end of the first quarter of the year. That's what we are going to do.
Yeah, how many months? 2, 3, 4?
No, I just said at the end of March, I think.
Is that in time? Because Ukrainians expect a Russian offensive to be imminent.
All I know is that is in time.
And will there be enough there to repel the Russian attack,
We'll
do you
see
think?
about that later.
What are you here for today?
To see the troops and to get a picture of what's going on here. What the soldiers are learning, what they are doing, to learn the Puma and everything else.
What message do you think sending the Leopards to Ukraine sends to Vladimir Putin?
that Germany doesn't relent, and that we stand with Ukraine.
And did the hesitation, was that
We did not
time
hesitate.
lost, do you think?
We were negotiating.
And what damage was done to Germany's reputation? Thank you, Minister.
Thank you.
Deborah, that interview just there with Dominic, with the German Defence Minister. Germany's come under a lot of criticism for dragging its feet, is how it's been described.
And fairly so. I mean, Chancellor Scholz, the hope had been that he would agree to these tanks much sooner than actually happened. I mean, it only came out yesterday, and you'll remember last week there was that big meeting in Germany where you had the US Defence Secretary, 50 countries meeting, hoping they could have an announcement on tanks, and yet they dragged it out until this week. And you just heard the German Defence Minister speaking to our colleague. It's important to note he was only made Defence Minister a week ago. He has absolutely no idea about defence, and here he is in charge of this fundamental part of the West's response to Vladimir Putin's war.
OK, for now, thanks very much indeed. Thanks a lot. If you are just tuning our way, you're watching a special programme, a special breakfast programme live from Kyiv, the central square here, St Michael's Square, and you can see the carnage of some of the Russian vehicles that have been taken by Ukrainian forces, dragged into this square in central Kyiv as a demonstration, Ukraine hopes, to the rest of the world that they are doing what they can to win this war. I sat down yesterday, actually, with President Zelenskyy in a very rare British interview. Who spoke to me in Ukrainian and also in English, and I asked him about the war, about President Putin in particular, about family life, also about his relationship with Boris Johnson as opposed to that with Rishi Sunak. He talked to me about tanks in Germany, tanks coming from the rest of Europe, also that promise of tanks from the United States as well. Almost forgot for a moment. This is a taste of what he said.
The tanks could be here from Europe soon, but the tanks from America may take until August. Is that too late?
Too late. But I don't know really. I don't know real situation for now, for this minute, when they will be, when America will give us Abrams, and I don't know. I don't know really when from Europe will come tanks.
Mr. President, there's talk of a Russian surge coming soon. When do you think that might be, and how prepared are you?
Ми бачимо 6 днів вже посилення як на півдні нашої держави, Запорізький регіон, так само і на сході нашої держави. Ми це бачимо. Наприклад, на сході вони втрачають велику кількість людей. Ну, просто неосяжно. Їм все одно. Ну, тобто вони не рахують людей. Факт.
Under what circumstances would you consider peace negotiations?
Ніяких розмов, і це було до початку вторгнення. Президент Путін вирішив це. Я впевнений в цьому, що Україна – це перший крок на його шляху. Я впевнений, що він займається саме великою війною. Росія відійде на свою територію, вони визнають свої великі помилки, і це будуть інші люди при владі Російської Федерації. Ми сусіди, і тоді нам прийдеться розбиратися з цією ситуацією. Тоді, напевно, це буде можливо.
OK, so let's look at which countries have pledged modern military hardware to Ukraine. Should we? The United States sending 31 M1 Abrams to Ukraine, though it could take many months for them to get there. Germany has approved the delivery of 14 Leopard 2 tanks. Poland has pledged 14 of those German licensed vehicles as well. The UK was the first country to promise support, pledging 14 of its Challenger 2s earlier this month. Still no committal from France, though, on its Leclerc tanks, despite promises earlier this month that they would be the first to deliver, while the Netherlands, Finland and Spain have announced their willingness to send in their vehicles. Joined now by General Lord Richard Dannett, the former Chief of the General Staff. Hello to you, my Lord. Thank you for joining us on the programme this morning. How quickly can we expect those tanks to be in theatre?
Well, the countries that have pledged to supply tanks will move them as quickly as they possibly can into the area of conflict. But of course, for the first thing that's got to happen is that Ukrainian soldiers with some experience of operating armoured vehicles have got to be trained. Now, it's going to have to be decided where that training is going to take place. Clearly, it needs to be outside Ukraine for international operatives to be able to maintain consistency with their government's policy of not putting foreign boots on the ground in Ukraine. So in the case of the UK, I would imagine we have trained in Poland for many, many years, and that is the ideal place for us to train Ukrainian tank soldiers. But the important thing is that the principle has now been established that Western countries will supply modern Western tanks to Ukraine, and that's really, really important, as your conversation just now reported with President Zelenskyy. He knows that he needs tanks, he needs them as quickly as possible, and he needs them in the largest possible number.
What impact could they have on the course of this war?
Well, two effects. We know from all that's coming out of the Kremlin that their recent mobilization has put many tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of additional troops into the front line. And at some stage, we have to assume, and President Zelenskyy is clearly assuming, that there will be another offensive strike by the Russians. From all the evidence that we've shown, this will be a pretty low-tech offensive. Yes, of course, they will keep up their drone attacks, but we'll see massed artillery and we'll see massed infantry attacks. Yes, they'll use whatever armor they've got, but don't forget, the West has already supplied huge quantities of anti-armor weapons and has continued to do so. So I think we can have some confidence, and the Ukrainians will certainly have a high degree of confidence, that a new Russian offensive will be blunted and will be stopped. The big question is when the Ukrainians themselves will be in a position to mount a hopefully decisive counteroffensive. Now, that's clearly going to be some time away and is going to be dependent on when Western tanks become available. And here is an interesting issue, Kay. I don't think from an operational security point of view, it's very helpful if commentators in the next few weeks and month or two comment in too much detail on just how many tanks have been made available to Ukraine, when they will be available, and what they will do. There must be a building measure of operational surprise, which gives the Ukrainian High Command the opportunity to achieve surprise on the battlefield, and it'll be largely through surprise, a decisive blow, and the determination of the Ukrainian soldiers that will break the will and the strength of the Russian army. That will come at some point. When that will be is difficult to say, but I think increasingly it's going to become unwise to speculate about the strength and the timing of that counterstrike.
OK, we're talking about on the battlefield there, of course, aren't we? As I spoke to President Zelenskyy yesterday, he was also pleading for more missiles. He was also asking for fighter jets. NATO has been very reluctant to provide sort of air power, if you will, as far as pilots are concerned. And that, I suppose, is because of the optics of a European jet shooting down a Russian pilot.
Well, there are two issues here, really, and I think there's one of principle, and that is we have to be consistent with the line that we in the West are not prepared to put international boots on the ground, or for that matter, pilots in the air. So I think we will be consistent with that, and we will not operate with British, American, German, Polish, other pilots, our own aircraft over Ukrainian airspace. But it's a separate thing, and it's akin to giving them modern tanks. The extent to which we or other nations are prepared to give the Ukrainians more aircraft, airframes. It's not realistic to suggest that Britain, Germany, France will give Ukraine any of our modern fighters. Frankly, the amount of training that would be required would be too much. But there are countries that still operate many of the aircraft types that the Ukrainian pilots are used to operating, and that's a different issue. If there are a number of those aircraft available and other countries are prepared to gift the aircraft but not the air crew to Ukraine, that will increase the Ukrainian air defense and air capability. And of course, if they are at some point in the future wanting to mount a fully integrated combined arms attack, it will involve tanks, armored fighting vehicles, self-propelled artillery, and ideally air support as well. So it's really all a question of providing the equipment, the training, the know-how to Ukraine, to combine that with their determination and their will, so that they can put together an impressive all-arms attack, counter-offensive at some point in the future. When that will be, the timing of that, I think that should remain a matter of speculation and endeavour to cause a degree of surprise when it comes on the Russians.
OK, for now, thank you, my lord. Thank you very much indeed. There was certainly an element of surprise here in Kyiv when the Russians almost a year ago tried their very best to move into the city and take over the capital of Ukraine. The night before, the bars had been full, young people going about into clubs. We were hearing just last night about it was a huge element of surprise, although it had been talked about for weeks beforehand. When it actually came, the president and his family were actually in the presidential palace, family taken away, and ever since that day he has been day after day after day trying to bring this war to an end. Before that, before he was president, he was a comedian. He was the Ukrainian champion of Strictly Come Dancing, the voice of Paddington Bear, and, as I said, a comedian who earned a living by making people laugh. I spoke to him about the transition that he's had to make and whether he still has a sense of humour.
А чё, вот вчера пошли с другом на дискотечку. О, там видели прекрасных двух девочек. Ну, значит, потанцевали с ними, немного выпили.
А потом? А, понимаю.
Can I ask you about your previous life when you were an actor and a comedian? Now you're a wartime leader. How do you bring that sense of humour that you undoubtedly have to your colleagues in order to keep up their spirits?
I never lost my sense of humor. I think when people lose it, they lose адекватність, як сказати.
The state of mind. The state of mind.
I think so. Yes, you have to concentrate and be very serious, not during months. You have to do it in very important moments, in very difficult decisions. You have to be clever, and you have to be adequate, and you have to be brave, because you are the leader. That's it. It's very important. It's not interesting what you feel. You have to do it, and you have to change. If you feel that you can't, you have to change very quickly. Not to run, stay, change, and make decisions. That is very important, and very important to make decisions quicker than enemy. That is very important. Not to think. It's not about philosophy or something like this. You have to make decisions. I think that is steps to the big victory. Small steps, small victorious steps, small steps each day. Each day you have to, wake up and think what we'll do today to make this victory closer. That is very important. And that's why, but to be adequate, you have to sometimes, yes, in the night, have some, 15 minutes to think about, to speak with children by phone, something like this, to not without any crying that it's so difficult and very huge to lead the country without all these things. It's not, I think you will find some people who will tell about you like in social media, etc. Yes, without them, without it. You have to be strong, and that's why humor, sense of humor shows when you can joke, sometimes, of course, shows that you are okay, that you are strong, that you control the situation. It's very important to control the situation. That's it. Nobody can make decisions without you, because then the result. That the result depends on you. Yeah. So that's why you have to concentrate. And humor makes you human.
When was the last time you laughed? Was it my outfit?
Oh, no, 1 second ago. I think last time.
Yeah.
Last time?
Let me ask you this. It's your birthday today.
Yes.
Happy birthday.
It's not funny.
What would be
I'm 45. It's not funny.
What would be the best gift you could have?
The best gift. I don't like. I mean that. I had everything before my presidential time and before this war. And so I will not be surprised if we are speaking about some things, you know, some material things. It's not interesting. Yes. So, of course, if our soldiers can today deoccupy some little village, it will be great because it's so difficult. It's so difficult. Like they go 100 meters, 500. 300 and then 300 back and then 500 forward. So for me, the best present is walking forward. That's it. Thank you.
War spares no one, not even the young. But what will be the lasting impact on Ukraine's children of what they have seen and what they continue to go through? Joining us now is Ukrainian consultant, child and adolescent psychologist, Dr. Denis Ugrin. Hello to you, Doctor. Thank you for joining us on the programme this morning, a special programme from Kyiv for the breakfast show. What are some of the biggest challenges that the children here in Ukraine are going through at the moment?
I would say that children in Ukraine show amazing resilience. It's something that never ceases to amaze me. The vast majority of children in Ukraine will be fine. But it is important to remember that perhaps between 20 and 30% of kids affected by the war will need some support. And there will be a small number of young people and children who will require quite substantial support. Now, what I think is the key to helping these kids is that people show a lot of support where they are. I want to say that a lot of our children are now in Europe. Many are in the UK. And the sort of humanity that the British public has shown is incredible. It's something that Ukraine will never, ever forget. I want to say that for parents of these kids, there are perhaps two key things that they could do. One is to provide children with routines. It's something that parents often think that kids need some special, exciting things when they come to new places. In fact, the opposite is true. Kids do well when they have a predictable lifestyle. And the other thing which is really key to this is to allow the child to speak about what often were really unspeakable traumas back home at their pace when they are ready to do so, neither forcing them nor stopping them from talking about this.
I heard from President Zelenskyy. He told me that his 10-year-old son wants to talk to him about F-16 jets rather than playing soccer in the playground at school. These kids are having to grow up very fast. Kids of 10 years old should not be talking about the impact of fighter jets as opposed to who's won the World Cup.
Well, yes, children will always talk about things that, first of all, adults talk about around them. And second of all, they will talk about things that are important to them. It is tragedy that F-16s are more important to a lot of Ukrainian children than whether Dynamo Kyiv is doing well in our premiership. But it is the case. I really hope that it will not be the case for much longer. And I'm looking forward to the times when me and my friends who are children in Ukraine could talk about football as opposed to F-16s. I really hope that this time is not far from today.
Okay. Thank you for joining us, Doctor. We appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed. So, you've seen our interview with the President. You can watch it in full, actually, at 9:30 here on Sky News. Deborah is with me here in the snow in the central square in Kyiv. What was your overall take from what you heard from him?
Well, this is the man of the moment in terms of a wartime president with the biggest war in Europe since the Second World War, and someone who was thrust into this position. You really brought out how he, as he sort of said himself, he's fairly new to politics. He'd been a comedian before, and yet suddenly he's the man that the world leaders are speaking to. He's having to galvanise a Western Western powers that have for far too long underestimated the threat posed by Russia. This country was first invaded, it's important to remember, back in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and then that ongoing operations by Russian-backed troops in the east. And all the while, Western nations, in particularly Germany and France, were trying to get the Ukrainians and the Russians to speak to some kind of negotiated settlement. So to go from that situation to then galvanizing this huge effort over the past 12 months by Western allies to send tanks. They started off with those anti-tank weapons. You remember the British were sending in the NLAWs. So
German helmets to start with, wasn't it?
German helmets to now German tanks. But his big message, I think, to you was how critical it is to keep this support. It's not about politics. It's not about saying, I'm the first to send tanks, here, have a few tanks. It's about mass and it's about speed, because otherwise it's completely meaningless for a country that's going to face, let's face it, worse fighting, heavier fighting this year than last year, and a Russian president, whose ultimate goals for Ukraine, which is toppling the Zelenskyy government, taking control of this country, that hasn't changed. He's mobilizing more troops. The anticipation is that there will be a second wave of the offensive, maybe even a multi-axis invasion once again, as we saw a year ago.
When you say that, what do you mean by multi-axis? We're talking about coming in from the eastern flank, but also coming down potentially from Belarus.
At the moment, we're not. Yes, that's what I mean. But and at the moment, we're not seeing signs of that happening. You'll remember, in the build-up to the actual full-scale invasion, Western intelligence had information that this was happening. It was probably one of the first wars in history that the other side knew absolutely that it was coming. But this time round, all that's known is the mobilization is happening, the rearming is happening, the intent is there. And so for Ukraine, they have to not only dig in, not only be prepared to launch more offensives against these entrenched Russian positions because they need to get these troops out, but they absolutely need to keep galvanizing this crucial Western support, because without the weapons, it doesn't matter how much they want to win, they won't.
Yeah, OK. I know you're with us throughout the morning, Deborah, for now. Thanks very much indeed.